Welcome everyone to the third video in the Calico policy introduction series. And this video we are going to be looking at a namespace isolation policy. And in the policies board named policy examples, the second policy is named isolate namespace, and this is a namespace isolation policy. If you're wondering why these policies are highlighted in red, that's because these policies are currently denying traffic. I've simulated certain scenarios to deny traffic so that you can better understand the concepts we are trying to cover in this series. And the previous video we looked at how a workload was trying to communicate to an IP address of a country with embargoes and how that flow was denied by the deny list policy. Okay. So this policy, the isolate namespace policy, if I click on the policy and if you click on the endpoints selected as part of this policy, it appears that this policy applies to endpoints in the namespace policy example app1. Okay. And the reason for that is because I've selected policy example app1 namespace. I've scoped that namespace for this policy. All right, so this is a network policy. It has a namespace scope. Unlike the deny list, which had a global scope, this policy is scoped to a specific namespace. Now, I don't have any other additional selectors. So I don't have policy label selectors or service account selectors. And what that means is the policy will apply to all workloads in the namespace. Within the namespace, if you wanted to target additional or be more specific or narrow down the workloads, you could use additional selectors to do so. But in my case, I'm interested in selecting all the endpoints in the namespace, for the namespace isolation policy. Okay. Now, the idea behind the namespace isolation policy is to basically trust the workloads inside the namespace and permit traffic within the namespace. So you're not too concerned about the workloads inside the namespace and their network communications. You trust those workloads. So the idea is you permit everything inside the namespace. However, if those workloads are communicating to either endpoints outside the namespace or even endpoints outside the cluster, you want to explicitly permit that using a rule inside the policy. Okay. So we start off with this policy. For this policy, we're starting off with two, or rather one ingress rule and one egress rule. And if you look at the rules, they have a very similar pattern. And the way you interpret this rule is, for all the endpoints scoped as part of this policy, we're basically permitting traffic from all the other endpoints in the namespace. Okay. Similarly, in the egress direction, for all the endpoints scoped as part of the policy, we are permitting traffic to all the other endpoints in the namespace. Okay. So basically, for all the endpoints of workloads in the namespace, we are permitting traffic to and from other workloads in the namespace. Okay. That way, you're now permitting traffic inside the namespace. And if you look at the second egress rule, we're also permitting traffic on port 53. We're basically, in this case, permitting traffic, or rather any traffic on port 53. I've done that to permit DNS. However, you could have been more specific as well. For example, let's say I'm only interested in permitting traffic to, let's say, kubedns, for example, right? I could use an endpoint selector to specify, kubedns. That way, I would have only permitted traffic to, kubedns. Okay, so you have the option of being a bit more specific, but in the previous case, in this policy, I wasn't too concerned about specifying the endpoint to which I'm targeting port or permitting port 53 traffic. The rule was basically permitting any port 53 traffic in the egress direction for all workloads scoped as part of this policy. Okay, so very simple, right? So basically permit everything in the namespace, and we then create rules to permit anything else, outside the namespace, either coming in from the outside or going to a destination outside the namespace. Okay. So let's go to the service graph and look at this namespace. So it's called policy examples app1. If you go to the service graph and select the view named policy introduction, we're going to see a namespace called policy example app1. Okay. And when you double click on the namespace, we see that if you look at the icons in purple here, these icons are basically for services and workloads inside the namespace. Anything blue is referencing or is depicting a namespace. Okay, basically a namespace external to this namespace. So I'm in the policy example 1 namespace, and we see that all the workloads in this namespace are sending traffic to Cube system, obviously on port 53, and that was permitted by policy. Okay, we had permitted port 53 on the egress direction, and that's why we see these flows which are going to a separate namespace, being permitted. Okay, and we also see flows inside the namespace. So again, the icons in purple are for either services, basically workloads inside the same namespace, and anything to another purple icon is permitted. Now I can click on a flow, and that's then going to tell me the policy that permitted a particular flow. So if I look at the flow between summary and database, the policy that permitted this on the egress direction, so as the traffic exits summary, the policy that permitted this was the isolate namespace policy, and similarly as it ingresses to database, the policy that permitted the flow was in fact the same policy, because if you recall, we had both ingress and egress rules on the policy. Okay. Now I have a scenario here where summary is trying to communicate with the customer workload, which is a service that I have in the example app2 namespace, and we see that that flow was denied. And if you recall, in the policy, we didn't have a rule permitting flows to any other namespaces except on port 53. Okay. So as summary sends traffic to the customer endpoint in the example app2 namespace, we see that that flow was denied. And if you click on the flow, you'll also identify the policy that denied it in the egress direction. In my case, it was the isolate namespace policy that denied it. Remember, there's an implicit deny behavior. So once you've selected workloads in a policy within a given tier, there's an implicit deny behavior for flows that you've not explicitly permitted. Okay. And if I click on this flow and look at the detailed flow log, we see that summary, which is a service, a workload within this namespace, it's trying to communicate with the customer workload in the policy example 2 namespace on port 80, and that flow is currently getting denied because we hadn't permitted that in the namespace isolation policy. Okay. All right, so to summarize, a namespace isolation policy basically, permits everything within the namespace. So you can see flows between all the purple icons. You see that they are permitted, and they were done so using the first two rules that we had in the policy. Okay, as in the first ingress rule and the first egress rule. Okay. And then anything else that you want to permit to any other namespace, you have to explicitly allow. If you recall the second egress rule, we had permitted traffic on port 53, and that's what's permitting DNS to Cube system, to the Cube system namespace. And if you double click on the Cube system namespace, you can see that in fact DNS is sent to the Cube DNS service in the Cube system namespace, and you can double click on this to identify the pod backing that service. But back to our namespace, we see that DNS to the kube system namespace was permitted in this case. And I have flows from summary to my customer workload in policy example app2 namespace currently being denied because that wasn't permitted by the policy. Okay. So this is a namespace isolation policy. Right? That's it for this video. I'll see you in the next video. And in the next video, we'll look at a workload isolation policy. All right, thanks for watching.